Hello and welcome to Outside Views, the channel where we take a deep dive into the realities of Brexit and its wide-reaching consequences for the UK, Europe and beyond. Today we're discussing a topic that exposes the human cost of Brexit, the removal of EU citizens from the UK while they await approval to stay. And this isn't just a bureaucratic hiccup, it's a story about promises made and promises broken, about people who were assured that their rights would be protected, but are now finding themselves treated as though they don't belong. To understand how we got here, we need to take a detailed look at the EU settlement scheme, its roots in the Brexit process, and, of course, the broader context of the Trade and Cooperation Agreement, or TCA. Let's start with the basics. When the UK voted to leave the European Union in 2016, one of the core issues driving the debate was immigration. Brexit was sold to voters as a way to take back control of Britain's borders. A central focus of this was the end of freedom of movement, a principle that allowed EU citizens to live and work in the UK without a visa and vice versa for UK citizens in the EU. For many Leave voters, this was seen as a way to reduce immigration and prioritize British workers. But what about the millions of EU citizens already living in the UK at the time of the referendum? And this is where the EU settlement scheme comes in. As part of the Brexit withdrawal agreement, so the divorce papers, so to speak, the UK and EU agreed to a set of provisions to protect the rights of EU citizens living in the UK and UK nationals living in the EU. The withdrawal agreement was finalized in 2019 and the EU settlement scheme was created to implement its terms. Under the scheme, EU citizens who had been living in the UK before December 31st in 2020 could apply for settled status if they had been in the country for at least 5 years. Those who had been in the UK for less than 5 years could apply for pre-settled status, allowing them to stay until they become eligible for settled status. Both categories were meant to secure the right to live, work, access healthcare, and even claim benefits in the UK. In theory, this sounded quite straightforward. EU citizens were reassured that their rights would be protected and that the application process would be a simple and fair one. But the reality has been far more complex. From the beginning, the scheme faced significant challenges, not least because of the sheer number of applicants. The UK government initially estimated that around 3 million EU citizens lived in the UK. But as the deadline approached, it became clear that this number had been vastly underestimated. By June 2021, more than 6 million applications had been received. That's a staggering figure that just overwhelmed the Home Office. And this backlog has created a nightmare for many EU citizens. While most applications were processed relatively quickly, thousands were delayed or rejected, leaving people in legal limbo. And those whose applications are still pending are issued a certificate of application, or a COA, which is supposed to act as temporary proof of their rights. But as we've seen, this document often falls short of providing real protection. Now let's bring the Trade and Cooperation Agreement into the picture. The TCA, signed at the end of 2020, is the treaty that governs the UK's post-Brexit relationship with the EU. It replaced the transition period and formalized the end of freedom of movement. While the TCA includes provisions for the rights of EU citizens under the Withdrawal Act, it also imposes new immigration rules for those arriving after Brexit. And this has created a two-tier system. One for those covered by the settlement scheme, and another for new arrivals who must meet stricter visa requirements. The complexity of these arrangements has created confusion at UK borders, where enforcement officers are tasked with distinguishing between these two groups. And this confusion has led to shocking cases where EU citizens with pending applications under the settlement scheme have been detained and removed from the UK. Take the case of Costa Kouchiapis, a Greek Cypriot who had been living and working in Scotland. After applying for pre-settled status, Costa's application was rejected and he requested an administrative review as allowed under the scheme. While waiting for a decision, he travelled abroad. But when he returned to Edinburgh, he was detained at the airport and removed from the UK, despite presenting his COA and proof of his life in Scotland. Or consider the case of a Spanish woman who lived in the UK for years and applied for settled status. She travelled to Spain over Christmas to visit her family and meet her newborn niece. When she returned, she was denied re-entry and was deported, despite being in the middle of the legal process to secure her status. And these stories are not isolated incidents. They reflect systemic issues within the Home Office and the broader post-Brexit immigration system. The Independent Monitoring Authority, or IMA, has raised serious concerns about how the Home Office is handling these cases. The IMA is the statutory body tasked with overseeing the UK's compliance with the citizens' rights provisions of the withdrawal agreement. In recent months, it has written to the Home Office demanding clarity on the legal status of the COA and its recognition at the UK borders. The IMA argues that the COA should act as valid proof of a person's right to live in the UK while their application is pending. But without clear guidance, border force officers are left to make subjective decisions, often resulting in the wrongful detention or wrongful removal of EU citizens. And this is not just a bureaucratic failure, it's a moral failure. The UK government assured EU citizens that their rights would be protected after Brexit. And these were people who had made their homes in the UK, contributed to its economy, and became part of its communities. Yet they now find themselves treated as though they have no place there at all. The consequences of this go far beyond those individual cases. The UK's treatment of EU citizens has broader implications for its reputation and its relationship with Europe. The country has long relied on the contributions of EU nationals in sectors like healthcare, hospitality, and construction. And mistreating these individuals sends a damaging message, not just to EU citizens, but to the whole world. There's also a question of trust. How can the UK expect other nations to honor their agreements if it fails to uphold its own commitments? And what does this say about the promises made during the Brexit referendum? We asked this question so many times. The Home Office must act urgently to address these issues. It must provide clear and consistent guidance on the rights of EU citizens with pending applications. And the COA must be recognized as valid proof of temporary status, both domestically and at the border. The backlog of applications must be resolved quickly, ensuring that no one has to wait years for a decision. I'm quite happy that my friends living there all already have their settled status, but most importantly, the government must acknowledge and correct the mistakes that have led to this crisis. Brexit was supposed to mark a new chapter for Britain, a chance to forge its own path and reclaim its sovereignty. But as we've seen time and again, the reality has been far more complicated and far less just than a few populist slogans. The treatment of EU citizens under the settlement scheme is just one example of how Brexit is making a lot of things really terrible, and they are not in control of it. So thank you for watching Outside Views, and if you found this analysis insightful, please like, subscribe and share your thoughts in the comments. Do you think the UK has lived up to its promises to EU citizens, or is this yet another example of, in this case, post-Brexit broken promises? Until the next time, stay informed, stay critical and stay engaged. And if you want to see another video right now, the next one is right here in the end screen.